Hi, good morning everybody. So welcome back to our English series with my tutor. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of a shift as to what we've been doing so far. So far we've covered all of paper 1 on the English language AQA, excluding question 1 just because it's quite a straightforward one. So today we are doing a little change of tack and we will be looking at the English Literature paper 2 question 3 part 1, which is the large unseen poetry question. So you get 2 unseen pieces of poetry in your AQA. You get your one which is worth 24 marks, which is the bigger one, and then you get a comparison question with another poem which I believe is 8 marks. So we're going to be looking at the bigger one today. We're mainly going to be looking at how to approach it in terms of principles and sort of planning, things you need to consider essentially. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. If you've got any questions in terms of either for me or for the My Tutor team, so Bola is looking after the My Tutor questions today, so she'll pick anything up. If you guys have any questions about the rest of the online school, anything along those lines, if you've got any questions for me in terms of content or sort of general exam technique, anything you're worried about, anything you'd like me to quickly revisit, then please pop them either in the Q&A section or the chat function, whichever is easier for you. So for any of you who are new today, so my name's Vicki. So I studied English language and linguistics as my undergrad, and I did a PGCE last year, so I'm a trained English teacher. I've been working with my tutor since September, and in that time I've done over 300 lessons with them. So I'd like to think I know what I'm doing a little bit. So we will move on and have a look at our questions today then in terms of what we're going to be doing. So my LOs for today, my lesson objectives, learning objectives, whichever you like to call them. So understanding the question formatting for unseen poetry, because it's not quite the same as what you get in the English language. The question is always slightly different depending on the poem. And understanding the application of poetry devices to a text. So far we've looked at loads of language devices and techniques, which was our paper 1 question 2 on the language paper. Which we can pull pretty much all of those over to the poetry. But there are some also poetry specific devices which we need to learn in terms of terminology to help us along our way answering this question as best as we possibly can. So in terms of what a question looks like, so in the exam you'll be given a poem that you haven't seen before. You're not prepared for, you're on your own essentially with all the knowledge that you have built up over your GCSE teaching. So the question, as I said, changes depending on the poem, but it will always ask you how the poet achieves something or does something. So I think these are the last 2. So I think this is November 2018 and June or May 2018. Those questions, I think they come from those papers. I might be wrong, but they're the most recent ones on AQA's website that they've actually published. So on aging, how does the poet present the speaker's attitudes to growing old? In autumn, how does the poet present the effects of the season of autumn? So it will be something specific, but it will usually be how does the poet present, and then the subject changes depending on the poem. So to start off then today, a little quiz for you. How many poetic features can you name? So we've got pretty much all of the proud smile, hyperbole, anthropomorphism, all of those sorts of things. But can you think of anything which is specific to poetry? Then I'm going to do a little run through of the main ones that you need to know, the useful things. There might be some more obscure ones coming through, but I will do my best. I've hopefully covered all of the ones that you need, but we never know, I might have missed one. So let's see what you guys have come up with. Right, so yeah, semantic fields, we can definitely see a semantic field in poetry. However, that's not exclusive to poetry, so we could see that in any text essentially. Caesura, yeah, so that is a type of punctuation in poetry. Rhyming scheme, repetition, yeah, so again, that one's specific to poetry, but we can find it in poetry. Consonants, yeah, so that is consonants and assonance and dissonance we can find in prose texts, but we tend to find them more in poetry. Imagery, yeah, we can find that, but again, that's a sort of more general one. Essentially, enjambment, yes, caesura, alliteration, simile, yeah, those are sort of general ones. AB, so that's you referring to a rhyming structure. So yeah, absolutely. Themes and motifs, yeah, you will definitely come across those in poetry, but again, they're not exclusive. Rhythm, half rhyme, yeah, half rhyme's a really interesting one. Metaphors, onomatopoeia, yeah, but they're sort of general ones as well, but you're not wrong. Shape of stanzas, yeah, shape of stanzas is a really interesting one. I taught last year to a group of Year 9 students. I taught Only a Pawn in Their Game, which is a Bob Dylan song, but is very poetic. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature a few years ago, and it's all about sort of war and conflict, and the stanzas are shaped in sort of the shape of a gun. It's really, really clever. Stanzas, yeah, absolutely, so that's something specific to poetry. Emotive language, yep, so you will find that in poetry, but sort of that's more of a general one. And couplets, yeah, absolutely, so I don't think hidden meanings, yeah, absolutely, I don't think you guys have popped up anything that I haven't got already, so that is good. Right, so I'm going to run through these. So assonance, we've come up with. Refrain, we haven't mentioned. We've mentioned rhyme, rhythm, couplets. Haven't mentioned allegory. We've had consonants, enjambment. Haven't mentioned free verse, irony. We've mentioned stanza. I don't think anyone's mentioned syndectic or asyndectic lists. And I don't think anyone's mentioned dissonance. But I think we've got most of them there. Right. Anything else? Dramatic irony, yes. So there's 3 different types of irony. I'm going to run through them with you guys and sort of say which ones you'll sort of, the ones that I suppose are more likely to actually come up in a poem, and the ones that are sort of more worth remembering than other ones, because some of them are perhaps something that you don't necessarily see in poetry as much, or at least not at this level. So I'm going to definitely run through the different types of irony with you guys, because there's 3 different ones. Right, so I've tried to group these into sensible groupings, essentially. So sounds. So as you know, we looked at sibilance, we looked at alliteration and onomatopoeia when we were looking at our paper 2 in our Proud Smile. These are, well, definitely rhyme is to do with poetry, almost certainly, rather than prose. The other 3 you can find in prose, but you're sort of less likely to. So assonance, so this is a repetition of the same vowel sounds, so Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. So the repetition of the E sound and the I sound. Remember, when you look at vowels, we only have essentially 5 vowels that we actually write, yeah? So A, E, I, O, U. However, we can have 2 vowels next to each other, which create what we call a diphthong. So, for example, so delicious. So we have at the end of that the eus, which creates a diphthong. With this, you can see the repetition of 2 particular vowel sounds, so the E and the E. And so, for example, just with when we write an I, we could have I, or it can sometimes be pronounced as E. So it's always good to read out loud, or at least in your head. Consonants, so repetition of consonant sounds. So this one I've picked out from Docce Decorum Est. which is Wilfred Owen, so bent double like old beggars under sacks. So the repetition of consonant sounds there are the b and the d sounds, which are plosives, which I think some of you guys have come up with before as features. So I will go over that with you in a minute. We've got dissonance, so repetition of harsh sounds, so not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man. So we've got the t sound, the k sound, the l sound, are all quite harsh when you pile them all together. And rhyme, which I'm sure everyone knows, which is a collection of sounds that are identical, which go at the ends of words. So I've given rose and glows there as an example from War Photographer. So going back to plosives then. So I think I have talked about this, but I think I talked about this way back in week 2 of the online school, so a very long time ago. So a plosive sound is where we bring our lips together to stop the airflow, and then we have a little expulsion of air. So p and b we call bilabial, so that's when our lips come together, and then when we open our lips again, a expulsion of sound comes out, like a little explosion essentially. You get a little sort of puff of air essentially. So if you say p and b, and put your hand in front of your mouth, you will notice that you get sort of more sound on the p and b sounds as your mouth pushes the air out. So that's what a plosive sound is. I've purposely chosen Dolce and Decorum S because it's quite a common feature in war poetry. Someone mentioned that they've read some of these poems at school, so War Photographer is on the Power and Conflict bundle for AQA. Dolce Decorum Est is not. It is, I think, on the Educas, and I think it is on some other ones as well, but I can't remember what other ones they are. But Dolce Decorum Est, probably Wilfred Owen's most famous poem. You do get Wilfred Owen on the Power and Conflict, you get Exposure by him. Right, so let me just quickly check the chat function. Okay, so plosive is a dissonance, arguably, but dissonance is not plosive. Right, okay, so yeah, you could say dissonance as well, because they are harsh sounds, because you are impeding the airflow. So if you impede the airflow, you will get a harsh sound. So p and b are probably the most obvious ones for dissonance, but I've chosen twist and the l. So with twist and slack, with the t and the l sound, you still impede the airflow. It's just done in a slightly different place in your mouth. So instead of it being the lips, so say this is the roof of your mouth and this is your tongue. So when you say t, your tongue comes up and touches the either, depending on sort of how you speak, the sort of size of your tongue, that sort of thing. It either touches the back of your teeth, or it touches what we call the alveolar ridge, which is the hard part just behind your teeth. And that tapping stops the airflow. So instead of it actually being the lips coming together, it's the tongue, which is hitting the roof of your mouth and stopping the airflow. So either way, you've got stopping of airflow. I hope that makes sense. Right, so sentence level structures then. So I've picked out 3. So we've got enjambment, which you guys have mentioned. So enjambment, when a line runs into the next line without punctuation. So this is Love's Philosophy, which is in the Love and Relationships bundle. So the fountains mingle with the river and the rivers with the ocean. Why do you think this is a really clever one? I chose this one for a clear reason. Why do you think the poet has decided to not put any punctuation here for those 2 lines? What do you think it might symbolize and signify? Just give you a minute or so to think about that. Yeah, the flow of the river, absolutely. So yeah, right, you're absolutely right. It means it is sweet to die for your country in Latin. So I can't remember. Dolce is sweet. So if you do music as well, you might have come across dolce as a musical direction, which means sweetly, to play sweetly or sing sweetly. Yeah, guttural as well. So guttural is the right at the back where you produce the sounds. So sounds or cut and garavila. So usually the right at the back. So what happens is the back of your tongue comes up to sort of the back of the roof of your mouth, which is what we call the soft palate. So that little bit where you can sort of poke with your tongue and it'll move, that's your soft palate. Right, so juror, so this is a pause in the middle of the line, usually a full stop. So behind a scatter of boys, I can see, so that's walking away. So that generally signifies sort of the end of something, sort of tries to make something more poignant. Asyndactic list and syndactic list. So there are two. They are tricky to remember the difference. So asyndactic list is fast flowing. We usually have colons, maybe semicolons, not colon, commas or semicolons. So this is taken from Wordsworth, Westminster Bridge. Which isn't in the AQA bundles, but a very, very nice poem if you want to go read it, and quite a nice short one. It's a sonnet. So the beauty of the morning, silent bare, ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples. So really, really fast flowing. Now, so that's an asyndactic list. A syndactic list would be the beauty of the morning, silent and bare, ships and towers and domes and theatres and temples. So putting in some sort of conjunction, some sort of connectic, which makes it quite laboured. So we do find that in poetry sometimes. We generally more see the asyndactic list rather than the syndactic list. Right, text level structures. Let's just, yeah, I will write the difference down for you, absolutely. So this is your asyndactic list. Your syndactic, have I spelled that right? I have spelled that right. Syndactic list is a list which is interrupted by conjunctions or connectives, whatever you want to call them, which makes the list quite laboured. So, for example, ships and towers and domes and theatres and temples. That's the American spelling. Never mind. Right, so that's the difference between the two. Text level then. So this is looking at the form and structure, essentially, the big picture. So refrain we could have. So that would be a line, a couplet or a stanza that repeats throughout the poem. So very similar to song, so almost a bit like a chorus essentially in a song. So returning to something that has already come in a poem. Couplets, so a pair of lines next to each other which are the same length. So usually when we say the same length, they have the same number of syllables. And they rhyme. So we see that a lot in sonnets. So sonnets at the bottom here. So sonnet is a very specific type of poetic structure. There are different types of sonnets created by different people hundreds and hundreds of years ago. If you want to look into it in a bit more detail, you can do, but it's quite complicated and I didn't really have enough time to go over it well here. So if you want to find out a bit more about that, I suggest you perhaps go have a little bit of a Google, see what you can find out. So stereotypically a poem consisting of 14 lines, usually associated with love. So for example, we see a lot, Shakespeare created his own sort of interpretation of the sonnet, which was mainly associated with love. What's really interesting is you sometimes see in the Romantics the use of the sonnet, but it's not necessarily on a topic that you would associate with love. So for example, the example I've just given on the the last page, so Wordsworth Westminster Bridge, that is written in sonnet form, but it is about Westminster Bridge, which seems quite an odd topic for love. So you do find those sorts of things about the place. The poem always has a really neat formal rhyming scheme, and usually 10 syllables per line, but sort of depending on the type of sonnet, that might change. But this is sort of the general picture of sort of knowing that would be fine for your exam. They are incredibly hard to craft, and I applaud anybody who does a sonnet and does it well. It's something that I am not capable of. My craft isn't good enough. Right, so stanzas, so that's just the posh name for a paragraph in a poem, and free verse, so this is a poem which has no regular rhyme or rhythm. So that's something that we're going to be looking at a little bit today. Allegory, so a political or social message that we should be taking away from a piece of writing. So you'll see these throughout most of your set texts. So for example, I've put animal farm, communism there, and social responsibility. We see social responsibility and the idea that wealth should be distributed in A Christmas Carol as well. Social responsibility again in An Inspector Calls. A variety of political messages throughout the texts generally. And irony, so there are 3 different types of irony. So the one that you're most likely to have come across sort of in your schooling career is dramatic. So dramatic is where we as the audience know something, but all characters or some characters don't. So the obvious one is the sinking of the Titanic in An Inspector Calls. It says, oh, this is going to be a marvellous ship, isn't it going to be wonderful? So it's written, which is really nice because it gives us a clue as to what time in 1912 the play was actually written in. So it's set in 1912, but it says that the Titanic hasn't it hasn't sank yet. So we know that it's at least before April, I think the 15th, when the Titanic sank. So that's quite a nice little clue for us. The other one in An Inspector Calls is them saying there's not going to be a war. So that's just before the start of the First World War as well. So that's the one you're most likely to come across. We might have situational irony where the opposite of something that we anticipate is going to happen happens. So for example, attending a wedding to see a marriage between 2 people and instead the couple break up. I mean, it very rarely happens, but that is an example of situational irony. And verbal irony is basically sarcasm. So it's saying the opposite of what you literally mean. So my example there is when you're in a rush and you have a tire puncture, you say, oh, brilliant, just what I needed. Very sarcastic. Dramatic irony is probably the one that you're going to need the most. So I'd only really worry about dramatic irony. You can go off and learn them and really show off if you want to. Verbal irony you probably won't find in poems because we generally don't have a lot of direct speech in poetry. We do have some, but not a lot. So for example, there's a little bit in The Charge of the Light Brigade, but it is mainly just stanzas without dialogue. Right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about strategy and how we should organise our ideas. So I've got a poem to look at so I can show you sort of how to organise ideas. So obviously in the exam you won't have time to write a beautiful table out. However, just learning what each of the words mean for flatters. So as you guys all know by now, I am a big fan of coming up with these acronyms for you guys. So flatters then is what I suggest you guys sort of learn in terms of getting your ideas organised. So form and structure for the F, language devices, L, attitudes of either the poet, narrator or speaker. So that sort of depends on the poem that you're going to look at. Themes, emotivity and mood, and then readers' thoughts and feelings for the art and sounds. So as you can see, I've sort of bundled together, it's not an exclusive list, but most of the things that you will need to think of. So as you see, there aren't any for themes, because I can't tell you what the themes are going to be. Themes is quite a nice straightforward one. So what I suggest you do when revising your poetry bundles is you have a go at using this table to organise your ideas, because I think it is really helpful. And then you sort of got you've got one piece of paper which is effectively your ideas organised really neatly, whereas I'm sure some of you will have poems like mine which are really difficult to read because you've gone so over the top with your annotations that it looks like this, and you have no idea which bit goes to which part. So this is a really nice way of organising all of that into a table so you can understand how everything attaches. So it's a really nice revision technique, and I highly recommend it. I do it with all the poems that I do, and I find it works really well with my students. Right, so I'm going to look at blessing. I'm not going to do a model answer today. I have written one, but I want to focus more on how we use that table and how we organise our ideas. I've given a question effectively for what we need to be focusing on, but this is going to be more of an annotation session effectively. So in Blessing, how does the poet present the lives of poverty-stricken people? So the thing that sort of I think is a little bit of a bugbear with this question is that unfortunately you aren't given any context. So the one thing that I will say is that when you if you do use these tables as a revision technique, make sure that you stick context on the bottom as well, because that is really important. But it's not on the table for this one, just because we aren't given any context. So some of you might have done Blessing at school. It's quite a popular one. So this is written by Darker. So she is the poet who wrote Tissue, which is in the Power and Conflict bundle. So I've chosen something which is hopefully most of you will have already come across her work before. This poem is a lot less complex than Tissue, and it's relatively short as well, but there is loads packed into it. So let's have a little read of the poem. As you can see, it's really tiny in terms as poems go. So the skin cracks like a pod, there never is enough water. Imagine the drip of it, the small splash echo in a tiny mug, the voice of a kindly God. Sometimes the sudden rush of fortune, the municipal pipe bursts. Silver crashes to the ground, and the flow has found a roar of tongues. From the huts, a congregation, every man, woman, child, for streets around butts in, with pots, brass, copper, aluminium, plastic buckets, frantic hands. And naked children screaming in the liquid sun, their highlights polished to perfection. Flashing lights as the blessing sings over their small bones. So I think first off, what I'm going to suggest we look at is just generally form and structure, which is I think probably the one that most people find difficult. And I would suggest sort of just learning your general forms, because I think form and structure is one of the most difficult ones, and I think it does generally impress examiners if you try to tackle form and structure. So definitely do consider doing form and structure. So first off, from what we've learnt already, is it free verse? Is it a sonnet? Have you got equal stanzas? Is there a regularity of stanza lengths? Have we got any enjambments as yours? Is it a refrain? Have we got any couplets? Any asyndactic lists or syndactic lists? Rhetorical questions, length of sentences. So what have we got going on in terms of structure for this poem? Let me just zoom this out a little bit, and hopefully we might be able to get it all in. Not quite. There we go. Right, so peeps, what have we got? Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. Liquid sun is an oxymoron. I'd say the opposite to liquid would be solid. I suppose sun is solid, and the sun evaporates water, doesn't it? So yeah, I think we could possibly say that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Millie. Yeah, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. So that is the example for, I think Mr. Burling says, for the Titanic. Yeah, lovely. Right, so this is a free verse. So why do you think this might be in a free verse? What do you think the point of it is? What is the purpose of it? Ah, right. Yeah, I was so a triple. Yeah, I've just looked up tripartite because I wasn't quite sure what you were talking about. Yeah, so triplet, absolutely. So that would come under the language devices. So this is a free verse. So yeah, frantic. Yeah, absolutely. So we're there's this big panic on, isn't there? So definitely free verse going on here to demonstrate. Let's see which one to unplug. To demonstrate the so I suppose the spontaneity of what's going on here. Yeah, absolutely. Have we got any enjambment or caesuras? Yeah, so we've got some enjambment. We've got some enjambment here. We've got a caesura here. I think we've only got the one caesura. So we've got roar of tongues, which is our caesura. And we've got some enjambment going on as well. I won't write down the examples for that, but we definitely do have that. Have we got any asyndactic or syndactic lists? Have a look at the third stanza. Yeah, we've got an asyndactic list. Yeah, lovely. So the enjambment is showing the splashing and the rush, the franticness of it. Absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, brilliant. So we've got an asyndactic list. Now, so our syndactic list is aluminium, brass, copper. So the list of the things that they are collecting the water in. So again, showing franticness essentially. Beautiful. Right. So we don't have any rhetorical questions in there. We haven't got a refrain. We haven't got anything repeated. Lengths of sentences. We do have quite a nice range. So to start off with, we've got some simple sentences right at the start. Then our fourth of our second stanza is those 4 lines are one sentence. So we've got complex there. So we've got a nice range. Now, why do you think Darker chooses to have two simple sentences as her first stanza. What is the point of it? Right, so yeah, it's very factual, it's very blunt and traumatic. Absolutely, it has more effect. It shows how simple the problem is, essentially. So there never is enough water. So this poem is all about a community who live in poverty and don't have enough water. Yeah, absolutely, Emma. Right, in terms of remembering the flatters table, I will come back to that one at the end, so don't worry about it too much. Give me a shout in the question and answer section the last 15 minutes. Right, okay, so I think we'll leave that for form and structure. I think we've got absolutely plenty to talk about there. So language devices and features, what can you guys spot? I think I'm just going to, what should I do? I think I'll just go for a different colour and just write them relatively near because it is so jam-packed with language devices. So what can you guys see? There is loads and loads of stuff. Absolutely masses. Small splash, yeah, alliteration. So remember that you can say alliteration and that's fine, but we have a special type of alliteration called sibilance. So sibilance is the repetition of the s or sh sound. Yep, absolutely. Similes, yeah, there's absolutely masses of imagery. I won't sort of highlight where every bit of imagery is because it is most of the poem. Simile, yeah, so we've got a simile right at the start here. Right at the start, yep. Assonance, yes. Can you tell me where, please? Just pushing you a little bit more today. Sudden rush of fortune. Yeah, lovely. Lovely stuff. So I'm not going to spend a huge time on this because I just want to get through the flatters table. Yeah, so we've got plosive sounds going on there. So we could say that's either consonants or dissonance. We could say it's both. So there we go. Yep. Right, I'm just going to quickly point a few out so we can get cracking on to the next section. So someone has said that this one is a moxymoron down here. We've got some more alliteration, polished to perfection, but we've already we changed it to sibilance, didn't we? So let me get that one in. We've got a metaphor, so the blessing sings, and personification there because a blessing can't actually sing. So we've got personification and metaphor. With language devices, you can also, I would say, zoom in and talk about specific parts as well. So if you're going to talk about the blessing sings, talk about why it's a blessing. It's the title of the poem. Semantic fields we haven't mentioned. So we've got the semantic field of religion. So we've got the voice of kindly God, which is another metaphor. I'm not going to label it because we've already talked about one metaphor. And we've got congregation as well and blessing, which that should have field in there. Yep. Right. So we've got use of senses as well. You could talk about sensory description here. There's absolutely masses in this. I'm rushing to get through it. Onomatopoeia. So you have a lot of sounds going on in this one. So I'm doing language devices and the sounds one. The S of flatters rolled into two because it's quite straightforward to do it that way. It makes sense. Raw tongue's another metaphor. I think we will leave it there. There are several more in there, but I think that will do. Is if you there is no way you would write about all of those in the exam. The nice thing to do is sort of pick the ones that you think you can say the most about, or if you can link them together. So if you've got perhaps two metaphors being used, so the blessing sings and the voice of a kindly God, I think I would link those two together because they've got the semantic fields of religion in there as well. So you could talk about loads there. Right, so I'm not going to go and fill in all of those examples in my table just because we haven't got time and there's not much point because we've already written it down. But if you are revising and you want to organise your ideas, then this is a really nice way to do it. Right, so we've done our L and we've done our S at the end. So attitudes of the poet, narrator, speaker. So we don't really have a narrator here. It's very much sort of free and direct, really, isn't it? It's written in third person. So what do you think the feelings are, either of the poet or of, I suppose, of the speaker, because it is a recount essentially. So what do you think their feelings are? This is quite a nice straightforward one just to jot a couple of ideas down for. So I think we've done the ones that take the most time and mileage already. So what do you think the attitudes of Darker is writing this down? Why do you think she's even bothered to write about it? What do you think her message is essentially? Yeah, so semantic field, a semantic field is where you have a collection of words that you belong together. They all sort of share a sort of similar meaning or are in a similar category. So for example, fairy tales, princess, wand, magic, castle, that sort of thing. Symbolism, so it's symbolism is where we see one thing which stands for something else. So for example, here over their small bones, perhaps could tell us about the poverty. That could be symbolic for poverty and the fact that they're malnourished. Yeah, so I've just closed that and I can't remember what that lovely person has said. So showing how people are suffering. Yeah, exactly. So I would say that the speaker's attitudes are wanting to record people suffering. Which then we can link into the emotivity. So let's go down to that one. So why do you think Darker wants to record people suffering? What is her motive behind it? And also the mood of the poem. What is how do you feel? What emotions do you think are being portrayed here? Yeah, so there's definitely a sense of being sympathetic, and I think because it's written in free and direct, we can link with this one the reader's feelings as well. There's also a lot of joy in this poem. You know, they are so grateful for some water that sort of all their problems, the problems of poverty seem to melt away in that moment. Yeah, I think a sense of compassion as well. And I think she's trying to sort of convey some guilt. So there is definitely some allegory in here. So remember, allegory is a political message. So what do you think her political message is? We don't have any irony in here. We don't have any sarcasm. It's not that kind of poem. So what do you think the allegory might be? Right, so I'll go back to sibilance and assonance in a few seconds, just after I've got through this. So the allegory, I think, is that, again, social responsibility. We are responsible for the people who are suffering in poverty, and we need to do something to help. So themes then we could put in as poverty, suffering, malnutrition maybe. I suppose we could put pain in here as well. There's several sort of themes. Municipal means owned by the government. So when the municipal pipe bursts, there is a pipe. Now, we're not told whether that pipe just runs through where they live and they have access to it or not. But there's definitely the idea that for a pipe to burst, it's not being looked after very well. So perhaps we could sort of take away that perhaps there's not the love and support that goes into that particular community by the government, potentially, but we're not told. So readers' thoughts and feelings, this one links in really nicely. So sympathetic, concern, compassion, they're very similar, I think, to the speaker's voice because it is written free and direct. So this is something that you wouldn't be told in the exam. But Dhaka lived in India. This is written about a shanty town in India, and this is something that she witnessed and felt that she had to record because she felt it was so sad that they were so happy just to see some clean water. Yeah, so readers' thoughts and feelings tie in really nicely to the speaker's ones in this one, but quite often you will find that isn't the case, because usually you get a sense of opinion through poetry, but this one is more of an observer, really. Right, so just coming up to sort of the end of the session, so in terms of questions and answers, fire any questions, concerns, ideas at me. So there was one that I said I was going to answer and I can't remember. Yeah, we should be grateful for what we have. Absolutely, that's another one as well. Yeah, shocked, emotional is incredibly emotive and concerning as well. Right, I said I was going to go over sibilance and assonance. So sibilance I haven't mentioned on here because we've done it quite a lot in Proud Smile. So sibilance is a special type of alliteration. So it's the repetition of the s or sh sound in two or more words. So for example, the seagulls screamed and squawked. That would be an example of sibilance. But if you write alliteration, you're not wrong. It is a type of alliteration. But I think if you write sibilance, it's just showing off a little bit. So definitely go off and try and commit that one to memory. It's quite a nice, simple, straightforward one to identify as well. Right, so assonance is the repetition of the same vowel sounds. So a lot of these are very, very specific into a repetition of a particular type of sound. So it could be dissonance is harsh sounds, consonant is consonant sounds, and assonance is vowel sounds. Right, I think I've answered that one. Right, so I've remembered. So what if I forget what each of these stand for on the flatters table? So my advice would be don't worry about it too much because you will probably find that you do a lot of this already. You just don't realise you're doing it and you don't organise your ideas in that way. So when it comes to actually approaching your unseen poetry, I wouldn't spend time drawing a table. That would be the first big piece of advice, just because you don't have a lot of time. What I would do is perhaps just jot down each of these titles. So form and structure, language devices, attitudes of the poet, narrator, speaker. You could just jot down one of those and that would be fine. Themes, emotivity and mood, or you could just write maybe emotiveness, something like that. Readers' thoughts and sounds. and you could just write those down. So sounds, language devices, you will talk about without realizing that you're actually doing it, because it's sort of become so ingrained, because that's what you've been trained to do over the last few years, that you'll just do it automatically. And that's the big one that most people go for, and that's absolutely fine. What I would do is then take why those language devices and sounds are being used further by using sort of the attitudes of the speaker. You could talk about how they relate to themes, or you could talk about the emotivity of the text, or the reader's feelings. Sort of you can combine one of those to support your analysis of the language devices. And your form and structure, which I really do recommend that you have a crack at doing, because I think it's really impressive, because it is the trickiest one. Well, I think personally, and from my experience of other students, they find that the more difficult one. So don't worry about writing all of these down. You don't need to. It's just me being a teacher and just sort of laying it out in front of you. So don't worry about writing that all down. Right, revision tips for English. Normally I get told that you can't revise for English. Yeah, I was exactly the same at school. I was incredibly overwhelmed by English and thought, how on earth do I revise this? And I was at the same at A-level as well, because it's all about annotating texts. So a variety of things. So I would say with your poetry, use a table like this or something similar, because then that gives you a really nice, straightforward, sort of pocketed, for like a little filing system, essentially, rather than just looking at the poem and thinking, oh my goodness, I've got so much written down here. So that would be my advice for the poetry. What also might be nice is to have one key quotation on the top of the piece of paper as a heading, as that one quotation that you're definitely going to learn. For your literature I think is really hard. I would say read the book as much as you possibly can, even if that's just reading to a little bit of the audio book every now and then. Usually you'll find with most of the texts that are on the syllabus, there are usually YouTube audiobooks which are free, so that might be a good place to start. Organising some quotations, I would say learn your themes, learn your quotations, understand your characters, and really get the plot solidified. I think the first thing you need to do is make sure you know the plot back to front. So that may be using timelines, maybe sort of just writing down bullet points for each chapter, maybe all sorts of things like that. Whatever works for you. You could do mind maps. For your English language, it's more about the terminology itself. So learning your terminology and then doing some practice papers. So Save My Exams is really good. If you go on to TES, so that's a time educational supplement, which is mainly used for teachers to share their resources. You might find some useful stuff on there in terms of some past papers you can have a go at. We're putting up some written resources for you, but I'm not sure whether they're up yet or not. So I would say with your language, practice as much as you possibly can. I think that's the best way to go for that one. Whoops. So yeah, a caesura. So a caesura is a break in the middle of a line. So usually a full stop. So behind a scatter of boys, full stop, I can see. So it's usually just breaking it, sort of stopping the flow of the line, usually for a reason. So this is more sort of a realization that his son is sort of growing up, basically. Asyndactic. So asyndactic is a list which is really fast flowing, so usually commas. So the beauty of the morning, silent bear, ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples. Syndactic is when you put a conjunction in the middle, so ships and towers and domes and theatres and temples. It's really sort of clunky. That's what those mean. How to remember the 3 books I need to know if I don't know have the books in the exam. Yeah, it's unfortunate. When I took my exams, it was open book, so I didn't have to learn all of the quotations. I did have some stuff in front of me if I knew where I was looking in the books. I would say first, as I've said, plot, then characters and themes, and then quotations. Try and get maybe a couple of quotations for each character as a starting basis, and then sort of working your way up to more, essentially. Right. I think that is everything. Do we have to learn the poems off by heart? No, you're not expected to. Although I was thinking the other day, actually, perhaps it might be helpful to be able to recite them, but that is a huge undertaking. So if you're somebody who can sort of learn lines quickly, so I suppose if you're someone who does a lot of drama, you might be able to pick the poems up relatively quickly. You could sort of try singing them to sort of relatively well-known songs, something like that maybe, but choose a few quotations for each. So I'd say choose at least one key quotation which you think is the most powerful, you can get the most out of. Then maybe try and pick five other quotations which you think are good but not quite as powerful. And then if you sort of get to the point where you're retaining all of those really well, then you could build them up and learn some more. But I appreciate that quotation learning is super stressful. Right, so I've just answered that question. Right, Bola, I think there were a couple of questions in terms of the online school, so did you want to answer those?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Vicky. So for those of you that are asking whether the sessions are recorded, they are indeed. So we record all of our sessions and we upload them onto our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything, you can go on our channel and rewatch any sections. All of the sessions from today will be on our channel by midday tomorrow. So you should expect to have them there. Those were all of the my tutor-specific questions that I saw. Vicky, are you happy with the session now?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, someone's just suggested a revision task. So for literature, for the books, print the pieces of text out and annotate it from your memory, then look at your notes. Yeah, that's a really good idea. So yeah, think about character themes, context, structure. Yeah, that's a brilliant idea. So yeah, annotating text is a really valuable exercise, and you'll quite often find, so things like Spark Notes and various other websites will have will have extracts, passages which are very significant and really important for you to know. So that might be a good place to look in terms of, oh, I'm not sure what I've got, with Lord of the Flies, it's quite a chunky book, sort of faced with that many pages, where on earth do I start? Have a look at sort of maybe typing in Google significant passage for whatever you're looking at, and just finding some really rich extracts, so you are using your time wisely in terms of what you are actually analysing, because there will be some parts of the book which aren't particularly exciting, because that's how it is with books. Not every page is phenomenally written, and there's absolutely loads you can talk about. So that's I suggest that's probably the best thing for you to do in terms of choosing which pieces to annotate, and yeah, absolutely do that. So there are English past papers definitely on your exam board sites for you to have a go at, and we have put together some written resources, but we're just working out where they are going to go at the moment, so they will be coming up.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your time today and for delivering such a great session, Vicky. And thank you all for joining us. Remember, we do also provide personalised one-on-one tuition. You can find out a bit more about that on our site. Up next, in regards to sessions, we do have maths. So if you would like to join us for our maths session later, that will start at 2 p.m. this afternoon. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.